In the winter of 1894, the residents of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, whispered about the old man who refused to leave the abandoned Providence mill. Every night, as darkness fell over the Blackstone River, Ezekiel Morse would stand by the broken waterwheel, watching shadows dance where no living soul should be. The townspeople said he had lost his mind, but Ezekiel knew better. He knew exactly who those shadows belonged to and why they would never let him rest. Before we continue with the story of Ezekiel Morse and the dark secrets of Providence Mill, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most haunting stories from America's forgotten past. Tell us in the comments what city and country you're listening from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Now let's step back into the shadows of 1894 Rhode Island. According to the fragmented records and whispered memories that have survived from that time, the truth about Providence Mill was far more disturbing than anyone in Pawtucket could have imagined. The Providence Mill had been the backbone of Pawtucket's economy for over 3 decades. Built in 1861 along the banks of the Blackstone River, the massive brick structure housed one of New England's most profitable textile operations. The mill's waterwheel, an engineering marvel of its time, stood nearly 30 feet in diameter and powered the looms that produced cotton fabric for markets as far south as New York City. Pawtucket in 1894 was a city built on the backs of its mill workers. Irish and French-Canadian immigrants had flocked to the area seeking steady employment, and the Providence Mill had provided it generously. Families lived in company housing just blocks from the factory, their lives regulated by the rhythm of the water wheel and the sharp blast of the work whistle at dawn. Ezekiel Morse had been part of this world for nearly 20 years. A lean man with calloused hands and prematurely gray hair, he had started as a young spinner and worked his way up to floor supervisor. By 1892, he oversaw the operation of the mill's most dangerous section, the water wheel room, where massive gears and pulleys transferred power from the river to the factory floors above. The mill's owner, Jonathan Providence, was a man of considerable influence in Rhode Island society. His family had built their fortune on textile manufacturing, and Jonathan had inherited not just the business, but also the ruthless pragmatism that had made his father successful. Providence lived in a mansion on Federal Hill in Providence, rarely visiting the mill that bore his name, content to let his managers handle the daily operations while he collected the profits. In those days, child labor was not uncommon in New England's textile mills. Children as young as 10 worked alongside adults, their small fingers perfect for threading bobbins and cleaning beneath the looms. The Providence Mill employed dozens of these young workers, mostly children of immigrant families who needed every possible source of income to survive. Ezekiel had always been uncomfortable with the practice, but he understood the economic realities. These families needed the money, and the mill needed workers who could perform tasks that adults found difficult. He told himself that at least the children were earning honest wages, learning valuable skills, and contributing to their family's welfare. The water wheel room was supposed to be off-limits to the youngest workers, but as production demands increased in the early 1890s, those rules began to bend. Children were sent to oil the gears, clean debris from the wheel housing, and perform maintenance tasks that required small bodies to squeeze into tight spaces. The morning of November 15, 1892, began like any other at the Providence Mill. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of the Blackstone River rushing over the falls. Ezekiel arrived at the mill before dawn, as was his custom, to inspect the water wheel and ensure all systems were functioning properly. The wheel had been showing signs of wear for months. Several of the massive oak paddles had developed cracks, and the central axle had begun to show signs of metal fatigue. Ezekiel had reported these issues to the mill's manager, Henry Blackwood, on multiple occasions, but repairs were expensive and would require shutting down production for several days. "The wheel has been turning for 30 years, Blackwood had told him just the week before. "It'll turn for 30 more if we don't coddle it. Keep the production lines running, Morse. That's what Providence pays us for." On that fateful morning, 8 children had been assigned to the Waterwheel room. Their task was to clean the accumulation of river debris and cotton fibers that had built up around the wheel housing, a job that required them to work in close proximity to the massive rotating mechanism. The children ranged in age from 10 to 14. There was Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose family had come from County Cork just 2 years earlier. The Dubois twins, Pierre and Marie, whose father worked the night shift in the carding room. Young Thomas Kowalski, whose mother took in laundry to supplement the family income. Sarah Mitchell, whose father had been injured in a loom accident and could no longer work. And 3 others whose names would later be deliberately obscured from the official records. Ezekiel watched them work with growing unease. The waterwheel seemed to be turning with unusual irregularity that morning, and he could hear strange, grinding sounds from the gear housing. He had started toward the wheel to order the children away when disaster struck. The main drive gear, weakened by months of deferred maintenance, suddenly seized. The tremendous force of the water against the wheel paddles had nowhere to go, and the massive wooden structure lurched violently. The safety railing that was supposed to protect workers from the wheel's path had been removed weeks earlier to facilitate maintenance and never replaced. What happened next took less than 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds would haunt Ezekiel Morse for the rest of his life. The wheel's violent motion threw debris and broken timber across the room. The children, caught completely off guard, had no time to escape. The grinding metal and splintering wood created a cacophony that drowned out their screams. When the wheel finally shuddered to a stop, 8 young lives had been extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. Ezekiel found himself standing in a room that had been transformed into a scene from a nightmare. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. River water continued to pour through the broken wheel housing, mixing with what remained of the children's hopes and dreams. The immediate aftermath of the accident revealed the true character of the men who controlled the Providence mill. Within hours of the tragedy, Jonathan Providence himself arrived from his mansion, accompanied by 2 well-dressed men who introduced themselves as company attorneys. Providence surveyed the scene with the detached air of a man examining a broken piece of machinery. His primary concern was not for the families of the dead children, but for the potential legal and financial consequences of the accident. "This is a regrettable incident," Providence announced to the small group of managers and supervisors who had gathered in the waterwheel room. "But we must handle it with discretion. The reputation of this mill and the jobs of every worker who depends on it hang in the balance." The plan that emerged over the following days was as cynical as it was effective. The deaths of the 8 children would not be reported as a mill accident. Instead, they would be recorded as separate incidents that had occurred in their homes or on the streets of Pawtucket. A house fire here, a fall from a tenement building there, a drowning in the river. Tragedies that befell immigrant families with unfortunate regularity. The families of the dead children were approached by Providence's representatives with a mixture of threats and bribes. Those who agreed to sign documents stating that their children had died in domestic accidents received modest cash payments and promises of continued employment for surviving family members. Those who hesitated were reminded that questioning the official story might result in their entire family losing their jobs and their company housing. Local officials, including the coroner and the chief of police, were already on Providence's payroll. Death certificates were issued with falsified causes of death, and the bodies were buried quickly in separate ceremonies that discouraged questions or investigation. Ezekiel Morse found himself at the center of this conspiracy, though he had never chosen to be part of it. As the waterwheel room supervisor, he was ordered to sign maintenance reports that had been backdated and falsified to show that all safety protocols had been followed. The reports indicated that the wheel had been properly maintained and that no children had been working in the area at the time of the mechanical failure. "Sign these papers, Morse," Henry Blackwood told him, sliding the documents across a desk in the mill office. "Or find yourself another job. And good luck explaining to your wife why you chose to destroy this mill over a few Irish and French brats, who shouldn't have been playing where they didn't belong." Ezekiel signed the papers. The guilt of that signature would prove to be a heavier burden than any piece of mill machinery he had ever operated. The Providence Mill continued operating for 2 more years after the accident, but the atmosphere within its walls had changed forever. Workers whispered about strange sounds coming from the Waterwheel room at night, and some claimed to see small figures moving in the shadows when the building was supposed to be empty. Ezekiel threw himself into his work with desperate intensity, often staying at the mill long after his shift had ended. He supervised the installation of a new water wheel, insisting on safety measures that far exceeded anything the mill had previously implemented. But no amount of mechanical perfection could quiet the voices in his head or erase the images that haunted his sleep. Production at the mill began to decline as textile manufacturers in the South started offering cheaper alternatives. The immigrant workers who had once seen the Providence Mill as their gateway to the American dream began to find employment elsewhere. By the summer of 1894, the mill was operating at less than half capacity. Jonathan Providence, faced with declining profits and increasing competition, made the decision that Ezekiel had been dreading. In August of 1894, he announced that the Providence Mill would cease operations permanently. The remaining workers were given 2 weeks' notice, and the building would be sold to a scrap dealer who would dismantle the machinery and sell the materials. Most of the workers accepted their fate with the stoic resignation of people who had learned not to expect security from life. They packed their belongings, collected their final wages, and began the search for new employment. Some moved to other mills in Massachusetts or Connecticut. Others saved money to bring more family members over from Ireland or Canada. But Ezekiel Morse could not bring himself to leave. As the last day of operation approached, he made a decision that everyone around him considered the act of a man who had lost his mind. He would remain in the mill, living in the small supervisor's office, acting as an unofficial caretaker until the building was finally demolished. His wife Margaret pleaded with him to reconsider. "Ezekiel, there's nothing left for you here," she said on the evening before the mill's final closure. "Come home with me. We'll find another way to make a living. You don't owe this place anything." But Ezekiel knew that he did owe the mill something. He owed it to 8 children who had never had the chance to grow up, to fall in love, to have children of their own. He owed it to their families, who had been forced to accept lies about how their children had died, and he owed it to himself. Because leaving would feel like abandoning the only witnesses to the truth. Just when we think we've seen all the horror this story has to offer, the real nightmare begins for Ezekiel Morse. If this tale of industrial corruption and buried secrets is keeping you on the edge of your seat, take a moment to give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates dark mysteries from America's past. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that uncover the hidden truths of history. Now let's discover what Ezekiel found in those empty mill halls. The Providence Mill after closure was a place that seemed to exist outside of normal time. During the day, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating empty rooms where the sound of looms had once created a constant mechanical symphony. But at night, when the last light faded from the Blackstone River, the building took on a different character entirely. Ezekiel had moved a simple cot and a few personal belongings into the supervisor's office on the 2nd floor. He cooked simple meals on a small wood stove and drew water from the well that had once supplied the mill's boilers. The townspeople of Pawtucket considered him a harmless eccentric, occasionally bringing him food or supplies, but generally leaving him to his solitary existence. It was on his 3rd night alone in the mill that Ezekiel first noticed the shadows. He had been lying on his cot, listening to the sound of the river rushing past the broken water wheel, when he heard what sounded like footsteps in the room below. Not the heavy boots of an adult, but the light, quick steps of children running across wooden floors. Ezekiel rose from his cot and made his way to the window that looked down into the water wheel room. The moon was nearly full that night, and its light streamed through the broken wheel housing, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to move with a life of their own, and there, in those moving shadows, Ezekiel saw them. 8 small figures, moving around the broken water wheel with the purposeful energy of children at work. They seemed to be cleaning debris from the wheel housing, just as they had been doing on that terrible morning 2 years earlier. But these were not living children. These were shadows with the shapes of children, cast by mechanisms that Ezekiel could not understand. He watched for nearly an hour as the shadows moved through their eternal task. They worked with the same careful attention to detail that the real children had shown, reaching into tight spaces, gathering debris, moving with the practiced efficiency of experienced mill workers. When the moon finally passed behind a cloud, the shadows disappeared, leaving only the sound of the river and the gentle creaking of the damaged waterwheel. The next morning, Ezekiel examined the waterwheel room in daylight, looking for any rational explanation for what he had witnessed. The wheel itself had been damaged beyond repair since the accident, but parts of it still moved with the flow of the river. The play of moonlight through the broken housing could indeed create moving shadows, but could it create shadows that moved with such purpose and intelligence? Night after night, Ezekiel returned to his window, and night after night, the shadows appeared. He began to recognize individual figures. The tall, thin shadow that moved like Mary Catherine O'Brien. The two smaller shadows that worked side by side like the Dubois twins. The sturdy shadow that reminded him of young Thomas Kowalski. As the weeks passed, Ezekiel noticed that the shadows seemed to be trying to communicate with him. They would pause in their work and seem to look up at his window as if they knew he was watching. Sometimes they would point to specific parts of the water wheel, as if trying to show him something important. The rational part of Ezekiel's mind told him that he was experiencing hallucinations brought on by guilt and isolation. But the part of him that had lived through the accident, that had seen the terror in those children's eyes in their final moments, believed that something more profound was happening. 3 months after the mill's closure, Ezekiel received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, a physician who had treated several of the mill workers over the years, arrived at the mill carrying a medical bag and wearing an expression of professional concern. "The people in town are worried about you, Ezekiel," Dr. Whitmore said as he examined the sparse living quarters. "They say you've been talking to yourself, claiming to see things that aren't there. Perhaps it's time to consider moving back to town, maybe finding some help for what you're going through." Ezekiel looked at the doctor with the weary expression of a man who had tried to explain the inexplicable too many times. "What I see at night, doctor, is real. Not in the way that you and I are real, but real in a way that matters. Those children are still here, still working, still trying to finish the job that killed them." Dr. Whitmore spent the night in the mill, at Ezekiel's invitation, to observe what the troubled man claimed to see. When the moon rose and the shadows began their nightly dance, the doctor watched with growing amazement. "I see the shadows," he admitted to Ezekiel, "but shadows are created by objects blocking light. What I'm seeing looks like the shadows of children, but there are no children here to cast them." That's when Ezekiel told Dr. Whitmore the truth about the accident. He explained about the falsified reports, the bribed officials, the families who had been paid to keep quiet about how their children had really died. He showed the doctor the maintenance records that he had been forced to sign, documents that bore his signature but contained lies about the mill's safety conditions. Those children died because Jonathan Providence valued profits more than lives, Ezekiel said. Their families were forced to accept lies about how they died. They were buried with false names on their death certificates, denied even the dignity of having their true story told. Maybe that's why they're still here. Maybe they're waiting for someone to finally tell the truth. Dr. Whitmore's visit proved to be the catalyst that finally brought the truth about the Providence Mill accident to light. As a respected member of the community, his testimony about the shadows and Ezekiel's revelations about the cover-up carried weight with local officials who had not been part of the original conspiracy. The doctor began his own investigation, starting with the death certificates of the 8 children. What he found was a pattern of obvious falsification. Children who had supposedly died in house fires, but whose bodies showed injuries consistent with industrial accidents. Families who had claimed their children died at home, but whose neighbors remembered them leaving for work at the mill on the morning of their deaths. Armed with this evidence, Dr. Whitmore contacted a journalist from the Providence Journal who had been investigating working conditions in Rhode Island's textile mills. Together, they began to piece together the true story of what had happened at the Providence Mill on November 15, 1892. The investigation revealed that Jonathan Providence had paid over $3,000 in bribes to local officials to ensure that the accident was covered up. The families of the dead children had received payments ranging from $50 to $100 each, a significant sum for immigrant families, but a pittance compared to the liability that Providence had avoided. Most damning of all was the discovery of the original maintenance reports that Ezekiel had been ordered to falsify. A former clerk in the mill office, facing his own financial difficulties, had kept copies of the original documents that showed the Waterwheel had been operating with known defects for months before the accident. When the story broke in the Providence Journal in February of 1895, it created a scandal that reached far beyond the boundaries of Pawtucket. The revelation that 8 children had died in an industrial accident that was then covered up by bribes and falsified documents sparked outrage throughout New England. Jonathan Providence, faced with potential criminal charges and civil lawsuits, fled to Europe with his family. The Providence Mill was seized by the state to satisfy pending legal claims, and the building was finally demolished in the spring of 1895. But for Ezekiel Morse, the public revelation of the truth brought something more valuable than justice. It brought peace. On the night that the Providence Journal story was published, Ezekiel stood at his window for the last time, looking down at the Waterwheel room. The shadows appeared as they had every night for months, but this time they seemed different. Instead of their usual purposeful movement around the broken wheel, they gathered in the center of the room and seemed to look up at him. For a moment, Ezekiel thought he could see their faces. Not the shadows of faces, but the actual faces of the children who had died. Mary Catherine O'Brien, with her bright Irish eyes, the Dubois twins, with their mischievous smiles, Thomas Kowalski, with his serious expression, Sarah Mitchell with her gentle demeanor, and the others, whose names he had never learned, but whose memory he had carried for so long. They seemed to nod to him, a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. Then, as the moon passed behind a cloud, they faded away forever. The demolition of the Providence Mill began on a cold morning in March of 1895. Ezekiel Morse stood with Dr. Whitmore and several other townspeople, watching as workers with sledgehammers began to tear down the building that had defined so much of his life. When the workers reached the Waterwheel room, they made a discovery that explained the mystery of the shadows that had haunted Ezekiel for so many months. The Waterwheel, damaged in the accident but never properly repaired, had been continuing to turn irregularly with the flow of the river. The broken housing and twisted metal created a complex pattern of openings that, when moonlight passed through them, cast shadows that moved in a remarkably lifelike manner. The specific combination of water flow, broken machinery, and lunar illumination had created what Dr. Whitmore later described as a mechanical shadow theater of extraordinary complexity. The shadows that Ezekiel had seen were real, but they were created by the interaction of light and the damaged Waterwheel, not by the spirits of dead children. But this rational explanation did not diminish the importance of what Ezekiel had experienced. The shadows had kept him at the mill long enough to encounter Dr. Whitmore, and that encounter had led to the revelation of the truth about the accident. Whether guided by supernatural forces or simply by the weight of his own conscience, Ezekiel had finally found the courage to speak the truth about what had happened to those 8 children. The families of the dead children used the publicity from the scandal to file lawsuits against the Providence estate. While Jonathan Providence had fled the country, his property and business assets were seized to pay damages to the families. For the first time, the children's deaths were officially recognized as industrial accidents, and their names were properly recorded in the town records. Ezekiel Morse left Pawtucket shortly after the mill's demolition. He moved to a small town in Vermont, where he found work as a maintenance supervisor at a paper mill. He never spoke publicly about his experiences at the Providence Mill, but those who knew him noticed that he was exceptionally vigilant about safety conditions and worker welfare. Dr. Whitmore continued his advocacy for industrial safety reform, using the Providence Mill case as an example of the human cost of corporate negligence. The scandal contributed to the passage of new child labor laws in Rhode Island and helped to establish some of the first industrial safety regulations in New England. The site where the Providence Mill once stood was eventually converted into a small park along the Blackstone River. A modest monument was erected in 1900, bearing the names of the 8 children who died in the accident. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of young lives lost to industrial tragedy, may their sacrifice not be forgotten." On quiet nights, when the moon is full and the river runs high, some visitors to the park report seeing shadows moving near the monument, but these are likely just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind or the play of moonlight on the flowing water. The truth about the Providence Mill accident shows us how easily justice can be buried beneath greed and corruption, but also how the weight of conscience can eventually bring even the darkest secrets to light. What do you think about this story? Do you believe Ezekiel really saw the spirits of those children, or were the shadows simply a product of guilt and damaged machinery? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of industrial mystery and hidden truth, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker chapters of American history. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of the past, and we'll see you in the next video.